we're constantly encouraged, I think, in our culture to kind of be brutal and unforgiving and relentless towards those who are different than us or who say things that offend us. And that's a very polarizing way of life. But I think the world needs people who look at others with real love and treat each other with a kind of kindness that Christ shows us.
Hello, and welcome to the Shifting Culture podcast, in which we have conversations about the culture we create and the impact we can make. We long to see the body of Christ look like Jesus. I'm your host, Joshua Johnson. Every culture tends to read Jesus through its own lens, and the same instinct that filters him through culture is the one that quietly remakes him in our own image, reshaping him to fit flag and party, platform and power, consumer faith and the cult of efficiency, idols that rarely announce themselves as idols, but arrive dressed in respectable cultural clothes, coming for the political right and the political left alike. Graham Joseph Hill has spent years listening to the global church, and in his new book, 10 Movements of the Jesus Way, he names the false gods that sicken the heart and maps the turns back toward a wilder, more unsettling Christ. This conversation moves through these 10 movements. How to tell discipleship from cultural conformity, why peacemaking has become a radical act, what it means to hold power the way Jesus did, and how a slower, table-centered life exposes what we've made ultimate. So how do you tell whether you're following Jesus or just following your culture with Jesus attached? Join us as we figure it out. Here is my conversation with Graham Joseph Hill. Graham, welcome to Shifting Culture. Excited to have you on. Thanks for joining me.
Thank you. It's lovely to be with you.
I'd love to hear some of your story of you maybe coming to Christ and your relationship with the church and Christianity, and how has that morphed and changed, and how has your viewpoint of all of that changed over time?
I grew up in a Christian household. It was a Dutch Reformed family living in working class area of Sydney. And I came to faith like many in my teen years, explored faith initially in Pentecostalism through church planting and received a version of Jesus that was quite legalistic, I would say, and then went from church planting into theological education, became very interested in what God was doing globally through the Global Church Project, traveled around the globe, interviewing people and getting a sense of what God is doing in mission and worship and community and theology globally. And over time, developed a sense of a God who is much bigger, more diverse, more extraordinary than I had imagined. And I think that shaped my view of Christ through listening to such diverse voices. And I returned again and again to the Gospels. The Gospels, even when I was a teenager, the Gospels captivated my heart and mind and presented to me a way that is quite different and challenging compared to what I'd received in many parts of the life of the church.
If you're looking at the Gospels and you were traveling around looking at the global church and you're saying, what is God doing there? When you first started to follow Christ, be in the church, through church planting, Pentecostalism, you had a legalistic Christ, and the version of Christ was legalistic. That seems very cultural and particular to a specific culture, a version of Christ. As you were looking at the diversity of cultures around the world, did you find as well particular cultures had a distinct view of Christ?
I would say that all cultures tend to view Christ and read the Gospels through their own cultural lens. So It doesn't matter whether you're in the United States or whether you're in Australia. It doesn't matter whether you're in the Philippines, where my wife's family are from. We tend to read the Gospels and to approach Jesus through that cultural lens. So, from my own cultural background, which of course is white, Anglo, Western, I tend to read the Gospels through a very individualistic, a very me-centered lens. When I listen to what Jesus is saying, my temptation is always to hear him talking about me personally and giving me personal, moral, individual instructions. But when I think about, say, for instance, my wife's culture, Filipino culture, which is much more communal, much more relational, has a much greater sense of responsibility to the group. When you find a presentation of Jesus or an interpretation of Jesus in the Gospels, which is much more about Christ speaking to the community, speaking to the family, speaking to the neighborhood, and his words, instead of being individual words to an individual believer for an individual to follow in a particular circumstance, although it does include that, of course, often are words which are received as words to the whole community. And I think that there are both ways of valid ways of actually engaging with Jesus. They're quite different ways of engaging with Jesus. But even when I look at the Sermon on the Mount, for instance, I think there are ways in which Jesus is speaking to us individually, but also ways in which Jesus is actually presenting a vision, kind of a mission statement for the whole people of God as a community of faith. So that might be one example of ways in which we all do it. We come to Jesus in unique and ways that reflect our culture.
As we're looking and we want to be disciples of Jesus, we want to follow him, we want to follow the ways of Jesus. How do we know we're following the ways of Jesus and not just following the ways of our culture with Jesus tacked on to the side?
Yeah, and that is a tricky one, because it's possible for us to shape Jesus in our own image, and we're all tempted to do it, I think. So it might be the case that for some of us, there is a temptation to shape Jesus in the image of flag, nation, or political party, or political interest. Or it might be possible to shape Jesus in the image of a slogan or some other kind of cultural perspective. So that's always a temptation. I think the way that we prevent ourselves from merely shaping Jesus in our own image and only seeing Jesus through the lens of our particular culture happens in two ways. So, firstly, I think it begins with examining the Jesus of the Gospels through a historical lens and asking, who is this Jesus in his particular culture, in his particular time? How would have his message and his perspectives been received? What were they intended to communicate? How do I understand this Jesus in ways that might contradict or affront or just be very different than the way in which my particular culture might receive him? So that's the first way, digging deeply into the who is this historical Jesus and what are the particular things that he is saying in his particular cultural context. Jesus, the Jew of first century Palestine. And I think the second way is to listen deeply to other traditions and other cultures as they engage with Jesus. So, what do they see? What do they hear? And it's not as though we absorb that uncritically, because, of course, they run the risk of making the same error, and that is just presenting Jesus in the image of their own culture. But as we listen to diverse cultures, many voices, many traditions and backgrounds, we gain a broad, colourful picture of Jesus that begins to kind of challenge, confront, maybe reshape our own image of Jesus in ways that are really helpful. And I would say, the other thing I would say, that's a lifelong journey. So the way I understand Jesus today in my 50s, as a result of listening to voices across the global church, is very different than in my 40s, which was quite different than my 30s. I hope that's going to be a lifelong journey. And I hope that I'm constantly unsettled in my view of Jesus. I hope that the scriptures, the spirit, and the voices of the global church keep challenging me to see Jesus in fresh ways.
If I look at your book and read your book, one of the underlying tones I could see is Bonhoeffer's cost of discipleship. It feels like there's something foundational for you as you're thinking through discipleship and costly discipleship, what that looks like. What is it for you about Bonhoeffer and what he's saying in Cost of Discipleship that brings us to the point of your book?
The reason why I wrote this book is out of an ache. I think that we talk a lot about discipleship, so we've got a extensive vocabulary around discipleship, but living like Jesus, walking like Jesus, conforming to Jesus. Bonhoeffer talks a lot about conforming to Jesus, and all of the costs that entails is something that we often avoid. And so there's a gap there. And I've watched both political extremes remaking Jesus in their own image. And I'm as guilty of that as anybody. I always run that risk myself. There's always a danger that we remake Jesus in our own image. And Bonhoeffer reminds us, just as Jesus does, that we can't cage God. And what I try to do in the book is, I guess, diagnose a spiritual malaise or illness, the idols that sicken the heart, that prevent us from paying the price of the cost of discipleship or receiving the joy of the liberation of discipleship. And those idols include success, competition, power, retribution, compromise, indifference, conflict, legalism, exclusion, self-sufficiency, hurry. The idols are many, and the false gods reach us through culture, not just through religious institutions, always seeking to reshape our imaginations, to capture our hearts, to prevent us from paying the price or the cost of discipleship and experiencing the fullness of life that Jesus would offer.
Both political extremes or sides are trying to remake Jesus in their own image. And Jesus is sitting in a different spot than both of those
Mm.
extremes. What does it look like to follow Jesus and not follow the extremes of the political ideologies, but have Jesus as the middle and not just be a soft intermediary between the two, but be it
Mm.
costly and full of like nuance and grace and peace in the midst of the tension?
Yeah. I think that the idols of Western culture, and they are as prevalent in Australia as they are in Western Europe or in the United States. And actually, so many of these idols, of course, are global idols. They present themselves to the East and the global South as well. But the idols of Western culture are as alluring, as tempting, and as dangerous to us if we are on the political right or the political left, or the cultural right or the cultural left. It is true that we all tend to remake Jesus in our own image, but the idols that come to us, the idols of power, a desire for power, whether it's political or cultural power, a desire for self-preservation, the impulse toward hurry and busyness, all of these idols dress themselves in respectable and cultural clothes, and they come to us wherever we sit on the political spectrum. I don't think that they're only tempting for one particular group. And so for us, it's a matter of asking, if I look at my heart today, if I look at the group that I'm a part of today, how has it been captured by these particular trends, cultural trends, and desires?
What's a particular idol that you see around you right now that is prevalent?
I think that some of the idols that are prevalent are things like the allure of nationalism, a kind of political idolatry. There's the idol of power and platform. There's the idol of consumer faith. There's the idol of fear and the cultural wars, or of comfort and of privilege. I think these idols are very prevalent in our culture. And as I listen to the global church, I'm reminded, of course, that another set of idols comes to us culturally, where these are idols of wealth and gender and privilege and whiteness, if you want to talk about it in those terms, that numb us to the Jesus way and that dull us to the suffering and the humiliation of people on the margins.
So what does that turn look like for you to counteract that idol and start to follow Jesus in the middle? Hey everyone, thank you so much for listening and thank you for supporting the show. If you'd like to support the show and get early ad-free episodes, you go to Substack at shiftingculture.substack.com, and with your subscription, you could have a private podcast feed in your podcast app where you get to download early episodes before anybody gets to listen to them. You could also support the show by going to the support the show link at the bottom of the show notes in the app that you're using right now. That goes to a page that supports the work my wife and I do around the world. That donation is also tax deductible. So if you want a tax deductible donation, you could go there. Or if you want to support the show by leaving a rating and review on Apple Podcasts or Spotify, that really helps new listeners find the show as well. So thank you so much for listening. Thank you for your support. And thank you so much for supporting this work so that we could see the body of Christ look more like Jesus.
I think repentance, or that turn, is about embracing humility and apprenticeship. So it's being open to listen and to learn from voices that are rarely heard, voices which are sometimes actively silenced or at least not listened to actively. Having the humility to hear voices that challenge us, unsettle us, confront us. Jesus instituted a humility revolution, and we are called to be a people of humility. So it's about humility, but it's also about apprenticeship. It's apprenticeship to Jesus and to Jesus' way, but also willing to be listeners and learners to the voices of the global church, the church. And that includes choosing simplicity. So the turning is about choosing simplicity, trading influence for service. And the world needs a humbler, holier, more loving church that is shaped in the image of Christ and that embraces the Beatitudes in their fullness.
That would be amazing if that could happen.
Yeah.
It would be so nice. When that is not happening, if we're not embracing the Beatitudes of fullness, we actually don't see blessed are the peacemakers. We don't see peacemaking. We see a lot of conflicts. One of your movements is from conflicts to peacemaking. I think maybe we often focus more on the conflict anyways and the idol than the goodness and peace in the world. And there's plenty of it and there's good, but we actually just focus on the conflict.
Yeah.
But it seems to be full of conflict, this world, which of course it is. What does peacemaking look like as we're following Jesus? How do we not just have cheap peace in the middle of conflict?
Yeah, and that's a good corrective that you just introduced there, that while it is true that it's important for us to identify the particular idols and temptations and the malforming of our desires that happens as we're captured by culture. And it's critical that we do that. At the same time, there is a lot of joy and love and goodness and beauty in the world. And we also need to see where God is moving in that way as well, and celebrate that and pursue that together with others. So thank you for that reminder. Peacemaking is important. In some ways, I think that peacemaking is it's a dangerous, wild, countercultural thing in an age of polarization, of conflict, and of clickbait and rage bait. It's in some ways it's easy and tempting for us to engage in conflict today because our culture encourages it. Our social media feeds invite it, and it, there's something profound and prophetic and wild and unusual about someone who engages the way of peacemaking. It's just, and Jesus, of course, noted that that was the case also in his own time. So we've got to be careful about thinking it's only true of our own time. Peacemaking starts by naming our share in conflict. Where has my pride, my fear, my prejudice, my defensiveness, where have those things contributed to the conflict that I find myself embroiled in or tempted to take part in? How do I name my own share in a particular conflict or difficulty? So peacemaking begins with the heart before it begins in institutions or in politics or in argument. Then peacemaking requires us to listen deeply to the other, to honor and understand the image of God in the other, even in the other that we may not understand, that we may not agree with, that might offend us by their attitudes. How is God revealing God's self in the other, even if we don't agree with all the things that the other person is saying? And then the courage to step into broken places as bridge builders who absorb pain rather than passing pain on through our words, our actions, through our conflict. And, this is a very complex process. It's very difficult to know how to tell the truth in love while being peacemakers and keeping healthy boundaries. So it's a very complex process. I don't want to undersell that, but it's a necessary process in our day and age.
One of those things that it actually takes us to do and be a peacemaker is to be active. Feels like one of the things in the idols is actually inaction, or it's you
Mm.
call indifference. I would say we have a spirit of malaise where we're not really wanting to engage something. And you make the turn towards justice, and I think in the middle of turning towards justice, peacemaking can be a part of what that looks like as well. How do we walk with Jesus as an apprentice to him, which is an active, like taking steps with him and for him, and not just like receive, be indifferent, and we're just sitting around, but we're actually active in our faith?
And it is true that we need to move from indifference, because indifference is the thing that really will erode our ability to imitate Christ, erode our commitment to justice, and dismantle our desire to actively follow Jesus. And our comfort and self-preservation often numb us to other people's suffering and prevent us from actively pursuing the Jesus way. So I think it's important for how do we actively pursue the Jesus way? I think that it begins by looking deeply inside our hearts it begins by taking the time to meet the Jesus of the Gospels. And the only way to do that is to spend slow, dedicated time to immersing ourselves in the Gospels, to listening to what does Jesus say, what moves him, what does he value, what angers him, what delights him, what does he prioritize. And the only way to do that is to spend slow, long, concentrated, humble, prayerful time in the Gospels on a daily basis. So for me personally, part of my daily practice is to sit as I might be reading a particular through a particular book of the Bible, but every day I try to read a part of the Gospels and ask myself, who is this Jesus and what is this Jesus saying to me? Is there a particular thing that Jesus wants to say to me through this particular gospel passage today? It might be about my consumer faith. It could be about my temptation towards fear or comfort or privilege. And then asking, what is one thing that Jesus wants me to do today that subverts those impulses, that confronts those idols in my heart, and that begins me on the active, intentional road of becoming like Jesus.
So as you're looking through the Gospels and you're being immersed in the Gospels every day, what is illuminating for you? What's illuminated in the Gospels that makes the Jesus way for you particularly fascinating and like wonderful and something that you want to
Hmm.
say, I want to give my life for this. I want to follow this way.
I'll begin with a particular example of one of the practices I talk about is the movement from frenetic activity to slow discipleship. And anyone who knows me well knows that I am a driven and energetic person. I came out of a background of disadvantage. I grew up in a poorer working class background in Sydney, Australia. My father was a truck driver. My mother worked administrative and retail jobs. Sometimes they struggled to put food on the table or clothes on our backs. And that was the environment I grew up in. I was surrounded by people who were quite not very well off and by indigenous people from indigenous backgrounds. And in that environment, I grew as a young person with a real desire to, and so I should say that there was very little ambition to excel in the environment that I grew up in. People left school very early. I remember when I went on to beyond, say, age of 16, on to do what we call the higher school certificate when I was 17 or 18. My family members treated me like I was some type of a Rhodes Scholar because I'd continued on beyond 16 at school. So there was very little motivation environment I grew up in to excel. And I grew up with this real desire to break out of the constraints of the culture that I'd grown up in. I went to theological college in a part of Sydney where there was a lot of wealth and privilege and cultural power. And I really wanted what other people had and what I didn't have when I was growing up and what my family didn't have. So early on in my Christian journey, I began to embrace this sense of ambition, this drive to prove myself, to have more. And that meant that I began to shape a spiritual life, a pastoral life, and a theological life that was busy and exhausted and in many ways broken. And in fact, I did have my own personal kind of breakdown because of exhaustion on more than one occasion. And so Jesus really needed to confront something that was broken inside me that came out of my own personal background and came out of my personality. And I remember once a friend saying to me, Graham, this drivenness, this ambition, this desire to prove yourself, to accumulate things that make you feel comfort in the face of the neediness that you grow up in. A lot of this is preventing you from being like Jesus. A lot of this is preventing you from being a spiritual leader. So Jesus really needed to confront me with who he was, to call me back to a different pace of life, to confront my ambition, my pride, my ego, my drivenness, and call me back from frenetic activity to slow discipleship, because Jesus moves, at the pace of the Spirit and at the pace of love. So, that's an example of one particular area I think that Jesus really needed to confront me on. Peterson talks, for instance, about how do we lead people beside still waters if we're always in perpetual motion. And I needed to learn to be still, to listen to the Spirit confronting my own idols, my own illness, and to begin to confront me and to challenge me and to give me the joy and the liberation of a new way.
So, do you think that there is something different about maybe efficiency and activity to be more efficient, and then the way of Jesus, maybe even slowing down, being more effective? Is efficiency and effectiveness sometimes
Yeah,
opposite of each other?
I really like the way that you're teasing out those things, because the way Jesus lived wasn't particularly efficient, but he was always effective. So Jesus had time for interruptions, and often the power and presence and love and goodness of God was revealed in the life of Jesus in the interruptions. When a woman touched the hem of his garment, when children began to surround him and his disciples said, well, you've got more important things to do. Jesus was always open to the inefficient, wasteful, sometimes, the ordinary interruptions in life. For those of us that are raised in cultures that value efficiency, that encourage us to always look at everything we're doing and ask, how are we squeezing the most out of every moment? And are we really working towards important priorities and that kind of thing? Jesus lived a very kind of wasteful, what we would perceive sometimes to be a very wasteful, meandering, interrupted life. And yet it was in those spaces that the holiness, the humility, the love and the power of God was present, and he was effective. And so we've got to remind ourselves actually that often effectiveness is found in inefficiency. Not always. There's also the other temptation, I think, to be kind of be lazy and inefficient. um, it's not as though the two are always in contradiction with each other. But for those of us that have made efficiency an idol, just remembering actually that often effectiveness and efficiency are not exactly the same thing.
As you've sat around the world, have you found a slower pace and slower way of discipleship? Are there any stories that bring people together, or as that slower way that was very effective?
Yeah, I have. And I'll use the example of my wife's culture. So my wife is Filipino. We've just come back from the Philippines. We spent it's winter here in Sydney at the moment. It's freezing cold. Well, not freezing, as cold as some parts of the US, but it's freezing cold by Australian standards. I've been in the Philippines where it's been 40 degrees every day and sweltering. So I'm acclimatizing. But my wife's culture is a very relational, slow, and what I would perceive at times to be very inefficient culture. And for someone who is driven and who never stops and is always asking the question about how can I be as efficient and effective as possible in every moment available to me. Sometimes my wife's Filipino culture can be very frustrating to me because in Filipino culture, everything is about relationship and things move at the pace of love. Things move at the pace of relationship. And, you know, everything is done around food. So I'll use food as an example. So in my family, we would always eat on the run. And, lunch, breakfast and lunch, for instance, I would grab a bowl of cereal and it'd be over and done with in 20 minutes. At lunchtime, I would slap a bit of peanut butter or jam on a sandwich and it'd be done in 15 minutes so I could get on to the next thing. In my wife's culture, um, I sometimes wonder how they get anything done because, you know, you've spent, 2 hours preparing breakfast and then sitting around eating together. And then you're almost ready to start preparing lunch. That's the way it feels like to me. But then I remind myself that, I say to myself, how do these people get anything done? They spend all their time talking and eating and relating. There's so much to do and so much time is wasted. But actually they're getting a lot done and it's slow, relational, intentional around tables, very much like the way we see Jesus behaving in the Gospels. And so that I see that a lot as I travel around Asia and Africa and Latin America, the Middle East. Cultures that are built around relationship and that are built around the table often challenge the way that we do things in the West. And so, it has been said that Jesus was, crucified because of the people that he ate with. And there is something subversive, there's something life changing, there's something profound about the slow, relational, intimate way that we can relate to each other around meals. Yeah, so my wife's culture is an example of one that's really confronted my own idols, my own cultural practices, and given me a different way. And I think that that different way is the way of Jesus.
As you're looking through these 10 different movements in your book, a lot of the things that start with some idols in our life. How do
Mm.
we recognize which idols we have so that we can make a move and a turn toward the way of Jesus and not follow the idols that we do have? Because I know there's, studies been that 95% of people will check the box saying, I am self-aware. I know what is going on with myself. But in actuality, it's about 10 to 15% of people that are self-aware. So how do
Yeah.
we go inside and know what are the idols that we're facing and we're tempted with?
I'm not sure I have an easy answer to this, but I'll have a stab at it. One of the ways that our idols are exposed to us is through the voices of those who are unlike us. They might be unlike us because of age or culture or gender or theological tradition. And we need ways to invite people who are unlike us to listen to us, to be present in our meetings, to help us read scripture in fresh ways. And we need to be open to them saying to us that they see something in us that we might not see in ourselves. They might name a attachment to power or privilege or comfort or an expression of consumer faith that we don't see in ourselves. And so it requires a kind of humility to be spoken to in that way, to be challenged in that way in a spirit of love. And hopefully they invite us as well to honestly reflect on and graciously reflect on what we might see as well. So I think one of the ways it begins is by inviting a range of voices, particularly voices that are not like us, to observe us, to listen to us, to be present in our gatherings, to help us engage with and interpret scripture, and to name things in our own life, in our own tradition, in our own community that we might not be able to see ourselves. So that's one way that it begins. Another way, I think, is to read widely. So, not just read books or listen to podcasts. So, it's not just reading, because not everyone is as into reading as I am. But if you're a reader or if you're a listener to podcasts, to listen to diverse voices, to read widely from traditions and backgrounds and perspectives that help you to see faith in a fresh way as well. So I think that can help. And then thirdly, I would say that all of us need a spiritual directors or spiritual mentors who we give permission to confront us constantly with the idolatry or the compromise or the brokenness in our own lives, while at the same time reminding us of the goodness and the holiness and the expressions and the image of God in our own lives. We give permission to those people to really speak to us. I've got a spiritual director who I meet with regularly, and he unsettles me constantly. He'll put his finger on things that I say. He won't let me get away with things, so I tend to be, as you probably noticed even in this podcast, I tend to speak a lot, and often I will hide behind words, but he will listen very closely to what I'm saying, and he'll just put his finger on a perspective or a value or a hidden motive or something inside me that is not really walking the Jesus way or imitating Christ. And he'll prod at that thing and make me really uncomfortable. And so I think we need people like that in our life.
Those are three really great ways to be able to do that and recognize the idols that we have. One of the idols that you mentioned in what your answer right there was power and maybe abuse of power. I think a lot of culture in the moment, probably in the last, I don't know, 20 years, 30 years, we've had a lot of discussions around power and
Yeah.
power dynamics and who has the power, who doesn't have the power, and should somebody else have the power. If I'm looking about following Jesus and making a turn towards the Jesus way and following Jesus, Jesus had all the power, but he used his power to give things away, to really lift up those that didn't have anything. He used his power through wisdom and love in ways where we don't see it as often. We see
Mm.
there's abuse of power. How is power utilized well? And is it something we all just have to give up and become servants? Or because I think we all have some sort of
Mm.
power.
Hmm.
What is our relationship with power supposed to be as followers of Jesus who had all the power?
I've heard that there are power audits that you can do, for instance, and you made the observation earlier that we are usually not as self-aware as we believe that we are. Similarly, we're often not aware of the amount of power that we really have. And you can do power audits. I think you can find them online where they ask critical questions of you, where you examine your own life, your language, your gender, your culture, your position in society, and begin to see the power that you actually have. And I think using power well begins by recognizing the power that we do have. So Jesus knew the power that he had. And Philippians chapter 2 tells us that he relinquished that power. You can't relinquish something that you don't know you have. So I think it begins by recognizing the power we have and then being willing to let go of the trappings and the privileges and the opportunities sometimes that power presents to us, particularly as it presents itself to us as a way of enriching ourselves, of making something of ourselves, of rewarding ourselves. So letting go of what that power might afford us individually, but embracing the way in which that power can be used for the well-being of others. So letting go of the way in which that power could just be used for our own benefit, advancement, and amplification, and embracing the way that that power can be used for the nurturing, the protection, the advocacy, and the enrichment of others. And so Jesus provides us as a model, I think, of that and does that consistently well. So he knows the power that he has. He doesn't, and he lets go of the way in which that power could only be used to glorify himself. And he uses that power to free, to love, to lift up others. And I think that we can do the same thing. And that's an expression of service. You know, Jesus reminds us that the way up is down, and that servanthood is the whole point.
Yeah. Yeah, that's right. Well, Graham, if you can talk to your readers and the people who pick up your book and read 10 Movements of the Jesus Way, what do you hope for your readers? What do you hope for this book?
Hmm. My hope is that my readers would be both unsettled and comforted. Unsettled by the way that we are tempted to drift from the way of Jesus. Unsettled by the way that our lives can mirror our culture and its idols. Unsettled by the way the wild, untamed, radical, countercultural Jesus confronts our perspectives and our values and our way of life in ways that really kind of should shake us up and move us to the core. So I hope that my readers would feel unsettled, but at the same time, I hope that my readers would feel comforted that we are not on this path alone, that the way of Jesus is a journey. You know, one of my favorite books is Pilgrim's Progress. And I remember reading it when I was a boy, and the story about Pilgrim walking on the way toward the celestial city. And Pilgrim is constantly reminded that in hardship and trials and suffering, on this long, hard road of discipleship that costs him everything, that Christ is with him, that Jesus is walking with him, and that gives him comfort. So I hope my readers will feel unsettled and also comforted by the presence and the power and the love of Jesus Christ who walks with us.
Well, Graham, I have a couple of quick questions at the end I'd like to ask here. One, if you go back to your 21-year-old self, what advice would you give?
If I'd go back to my 21-year-old self, I would say that I would say be kinder on others and be kinder on yourself. I think one of the dangers with the way that I've been talking in this interview, even, is that we might begin to beat ourselves up, to scrutinize our hearts and minds and lives in a way that is legalistic and a bit relentless and unforgiving. But I think Jesus is kind. Jesus unsettles us and moves us in the ways that I've spoken about. But Jesus is also kind and gracious and embracing. And I'd say to my 21-year-old self, be kinder on yourself. Be willing to grow slowly over time. Know that you're going to make mistakes. You're going to get it wrong. You're going to go through periods of burnout and brokenness and even failure. But that's okay. That's all part of the long, slow, difficult, costly journey. There'll be times of fear. There'll be times of pain. There'll be times of brokenness and failure. But be kind on yourself, because in all of those moments, Jesus is holding you. Jesus is walking alongside you. And if you're going to make it to the end of your journey of discipleship, it's going to be because you are held by Jesus. And then be kinder on others. I think the world needs disciples who are kind. I think we need a kindness revolution where, even though, we're constantly encouraged, I think, in our culture to kind of be brutal and unforgiving and relentless towards those who are different than us or who say things that offend us. And that's a very polarizing way of life. But I think the world needs people who look at others with real love and treat each other with a kind of kindness that Christ shows us.
Anything you've been reading or watching lately you could recommend?
Interestingly, like I'm a bit of I'm constantly absorbed in the New York Times. So I listen to a bunch of podcasts on New York Times, and what I would recommend is listening to podcasts from people from political and backgrounds that are different than you, in order to pay deep attention to the longings and the perspectives and the values and concerns of people that you are tempted to discard. So, I listen to, so there are a couple of podcasts in New York Times, some of them that are presented by people who are very conservative, and some of them that are presented by people who are more progressive. And then I supplement that by listening to podcasts from, I tend to kind of maybe be a little bit left leaning in my politics and in my theological orientation. So I listen to a bunch of podcasts from, stridently right wing political commentators, partly because what I'm trying to do is listen deeply to, what do these people who see the world differently than me value? What do they care about? Where's the image of God in their perspective, so that I can show them grace and empathy and kindness? So I think that the thing that I would recommend is not one particular book or movie or podcast, but a way of engaging difference and through listening to different voices.
10 Movements to the Jesus Way will be available anywhere books are sold. People could go and get your book. Is there anywhere else you'd like to point people to? How could they connect with what you're doing and you?
Yeah, you can find me on my Substack, so the Graham Joseph Hill Substack, where I post blogs weekly. At the moment, I'm doing a series there where I explore the 10 movements of the Jesus Way, so you can follow along there. And you can also find me on my website. And I hope that people find the way of Jesus both costly and life-giving.
Yes. Well, Graham, thank you for this conversation. It was fantastic. Really enjoyed talking to you and then walking through the Jesus way. Some of your story, the idols that we carry and the moves that we could turn towards so that we could be more like Jesus. We could embody the ways of Jesus in our day and age because it's so important that we do that. So thank you, Graham. It was fantastic.
Yeah, thank you. It's been my pleasure.
Thanks for listening to this episode of Shifting Culture. This show was edited and produced by me, Joshua Johnson, at Shifting Culture Productions. If you're enjoying the conversations, consider supporting the work by subscribing at shiftingculture.substack.com. For as little as $5 a month, you'll get ad-free early access episodes and other exclusive content delivered straight to your inbox. I'd love for you to not just listen, but engage. Reach out, share what's resonating, and let's keep shaping culture together. Whether you're a listener with feedback, a creative with an idea, or a brand looking to connect with a thoughtful, engaged audience, let's talk. If you're interested in advertising on the show, I'd love to hear from you. Contact me directly for rates and availability. Until next time, let's keep shifting culture.